Okay, last time I was here, we finished off the first major section with the end of chapter 6 and putting together some things, and just to tie that off a little bit, is the recognition of what he was doing there. And remember, I said that it really depended, and I don't know if I worded it this way, but the interpretation there and specifically depends upon whether or not you see the immediate context of the end of chapter 6 regarding spirit from verse 17, or if you're looking at the broader context from going all the way back to chapter 2, and maybe perhaps anticipating chapter 12, in which case you are dealing with the fact that they had the miraculous. In either case, the problem was of this idea of living a life of putting sin within you that was completely at odds with the life in Christ that you chose. That's the point, okay? And that was the big problem. Now, what we find is we find this in chapter 6 then, and close that off. Paul, the superb writer that he is, yes, inspired, but superb even beyond. Because what we find is he has dealt with the two major issues. First, the problem of division that was covered in chapters 1 through 4, and then the moral problem of fornication that he covered in chapters 5 and 6. But now as he moves into chapter 7, we are entering a very different section of the book of 1 Corinthians. It is essentially answers to a series of questions that it would seem have been posed to Paul by those of Corinth, whether of the house of Chloe or the congregation as a whole. And his choice as to where he begins with their questions shows why I think he's such a great writer, because there is a flow between chapter 6 and chapter 7 in subject matter, while in organization it's an abrupt change. And what that does is that it lends itself toward greater fluidity of writing and of reading and appreciating what he is saying. So if you're not familiar as much with what he's done, he's just been addressing the problem of fornication. Remember, that was first of all addressing the fact that they had not dealt with it as a congregation. Chapter 5, he called on them to deal with that through church discipline. In chapter 6, he then addressed the possibility of dealing with it, I would think, because that was the problem that was used by the father, which is a legal question, try to deal with it legally. That's not the right answer. And so then we had this discussion on why it's such a big issue, that it is a spiritual matter that was addressed that's going to keep you out of heaven, verses 9 through 11, and then verses 12 through 17, he had this first section on the nature of argumentation people might use to justify it, and then he flips that around in verses 18 through 20 to show there's no justification for it, fornication. Okay. Now, what you do when we get into chapter 7, and we're going to go ahead and read verse 1 so that it will be clear, is the flip side of this possibility of how people might seek to solve this problem. Okay? And that is where we read, "Now concerning the things of which you wrote to me, it is good for a man not to touch a woman." Okay. There we go. Now notice the starkness with which he just shifted. You have the first phrase, which is, okay, we're moving on to another section. You wrote to me. What are we going to talk about? It is good for a man not to touch a woman. This actually presents some great learning time possibilities for hermeneutics and Bible study, because you have to answer some interesting questions. We've seen this already in chapter 6. First thing you have to do is you have to figure out, was this Paul saying this? Was this what they had said? Or was this some third party who had said this to which Paul is responding? Now, why that comes up is simply clearly from the context. When he says it is good for a man not to touch a woman, he's talking about sexually. Okay, that's the first thing as we talk about in Bible interpretation, is you have to understand, appreciate contextually what he is saying. Okay, it's, okay, hands off, right? Now, what do we mean by that, or what's the context for that? Now, he'd just been talking about fornication, so the total other side of that, as he is making this big transition, is somebody, the question is, no, that's absolutely not even close, never. Well, that can't be the ruling. That is the whole idea of asceticism, which is to completely withdraw yourself from any kind of relationship, period. This was one of the things that on the one aspect of Gnosticism ultimately that they addressed, that then with a group over time, and I'm talking about centuries, then led into monasticism, okay, monasticism, which is what you get with the priesthood and all that kind of thing, okay, that high holiness is not being married at all, okay, and that's a higher form of holiness, taking this, and I would argue, out of context, okay. I think more if you go through and you look at this, that what immediately follows shows that that's not what he means. So it can't be, if Paul is saying that, you'd almost have to insert a word that says, generally speaking, it is not good for a man to touch his woman. And that would fit with what he would just said in the previous chapters about fornication. But if we recognize that he's had a major break here, then it was, I think, more likely that what he is saying is this is the other approach, that you have some Corinthians who had said basically, hey, everything's good, you do what you want. And the others are saying, no, you shouldn't do that at all, it's wrong. Now, if we want to get into the ethics involved in this, as I can see by your faces, you're dying to do. Yeah, thank you. Appreciate the honesty. What I'm trying to get to is the difference between what's called unqualified absolutism. Yeah, I can hear the snoring just after I say that. That's the level of interest in this. Okay. Let me explain why this really matters, because some people in the church can get caught up into this. It's very close to Pharisaism, a form of Pharisaism. And that is, we end up labeling things and the action itself as what's wrong. In this case, sexual activity completely wrong inherently. Instead of realizing that's not at all what God said or ever had in mind, going all the way back to Genesis 2, but it's actually the relationship that is wrong that is the problem. Okay? So that we end up labeling for different things as inherently wrong. Like say, we're going to have some kind of, let's see some basic examples of this. If you get into some kind of close, sexy, slow dancing thing, okay. Dancing's wrong. Well, dancing with anybody else than your spouse in that way in the privacy of your home, yeah, that'd be wrong to do. But then when we don't understand the context of it, then we make these statements as if the action itself, there's something wrong. Now, here's why that matters here, why I'm going into this. This is why people get the wrong idea, or at least I think sometimes their motives are not right anyway, about what they would portray as a Christian view of sexuality. Because all the jokes and things aside would act as if, because Christians oppose fornication and homosexuality and all of these types of things, and that somehow that makes it, we don't have a view, or that's just total abstaining at this of everything, and that we have it's good for a man not to touch a woman at all ever, which is not the Christian view at all. Okay. I like to try to remind people that even the people that they talk about like this, the Puritans somehow managed to have children. So when we talk about the Puritans in a particular way, maybe we don't understand what we're talking about. Okay? And certainly people, when they talk about Christians, need to understand that too. Okay? But anyway, that's the starting point for us to understand what's going on here. The basic point, which as we get beyond this verse, is going to be clear. But I wanted you to contextualize it and to deal with this in the very first. The general language, but he's setting the stage here for what's going on. He's got a contrast for what follows in verse 2 when he says, "Nevertheless, because of sexual immorality, let each man have his own wife, and let each woman have her own husband." Now, this creates other issues, okay? The first thing is, it says, okay, I'm not opposed to this at all. Okay, I'm not opposed to this, that's what marriage is about. But I think there's a wrong way for us to understand this. Does this just mean that this is simply a concession on God's part to something that really is dirty, and that God is just saying, well, they're going to do it anyway? Because some people seem to have that kind of attitude when it comes to parenting. Well, they're going to do it anyway. Is that what he's saying here? Well, they're going to do it anyway, so we'll have them get married. Remember that cannot be the meaning, because God's the one who created this and said that it was not good for a man to be alone in the garden, brought a woman to him, and verse 24 told them that they were to be one, and that included sexually, is what we just saw in chapter 6. So that can't be what it means. Now, I think there's a little bit of a hint that you will never catch in the English. The term, when it says because of sexual immorality or because of fornication, fornication is plural in the original language. It's just, how do you translate that? Because of fornications? Because of sexual immoralities? That seems like an odd kind of thing. You never see that given if it's given as something that is an abstraction. Okay? Meaning in one of Paul's lists about things that are wrong, and fornication is one of those things, usually it's at the top of his list, right? Fornication is wrong. It's not presented that way. When it's presented abstractly, that is just this kind of activity is wrong, this attitude is wrong, singular. There are exceptions to that, but for fornication, that's generally true. So why is it plural here? Well, I think that's a peculiarity of the language. And that he is actually referring to the promiscuity with which he's been addressing in chapters 5 and 6. And that was well known in Corinth. This is something very distinct. What he is now going to propose then is completely distinct from these types of instances of sexuality, that the promiscuity, all the idea of, we'll find how many different ways we can talk about it in a polite conversation in a Bible class. And this passage is always interesting for people. Okay, but why there's not any shacking up, okay, sleeping around, okay, all these things. That is, God has given something a proper place that is opposed to all these things. So the proper answer is not never touch anybody at all. It's God's put that in a proper place in marriage. And in between that are these problems we've been dealing with. Okay, John? Well, yes and no. John says, or is he repeating it if they didn't get the first time? I would argue that what he's done in verses 5 and 6, he's dealing with a problem. And he is addressing the problem of fornication. But what he is now doing is he's addressing something actually very different. He's addressing what God's positive view of sexuality as opposed to the immoral view of sexuality that had to be addressed. So that's why it makes such a perfect place to put this, and why he put this, I believe, just organizationally at the beginning of answering the questions, because it paired well with that previous conversation. Okay? Yes. Yes. Yeah, it's the overreaction of, okay, love is love. Okay? That's the first overreaction. And the other is don't touch me. Okay. That's the other one. Okay, he's addressing both. Okay, so it's same basic topic, but two different sides of the coin. Right. Now, with that in mind, then, let's consider the phrasing from verse 2. Let each man have his own wife, and let each woman have her own husband. I submit to you that the most important words in that are own. Because what he's addressing is the singularity of it, the exclusivity of it. The woman, the man. Now, let's notice some things just from this. Last time I taught this, which was a few years ago, this part of the conversation was not necessary. But the first thing is it's a man and a woman. All right? Make sure you got that part down. Okay? The other thing that I didn't think I'd ever have to explain is it's just one of each. These are not really hard things to understand from Scripture, and yet we need to bring them out. Okay? What is he doing here? He is actually alluding to Genesis 2. That God already has had a plan in mind for this. And that what they had seen before was in fornication is a corruption of what God commanded and instituted in marriage. It is a corruption of that unique aspect of marriage. Okay, that's what he's addressing here. This is what God has always put down and had in mind, which is where Jesus was and what he similarly did in Matthew 19, as he began to explain that. So now we move to verse 3, which it's one of those things that nobody wants to talk about in a Bible class, and everybody wants to talk about in marriage counseling. But I'm going to bring something up that we have to think about in a very different way, and that's why I think it's more important than we often give it. Let the husband render to his wife the affection due her, and likewise also the wife to her husband. Now, my question for you, I want to look around different translations now of the word that in the New King James is rendered affection. Say it again. Duty. See, duty and affection don't really sound the same to me. And I don't think that sounds like the same thing. What else we got? Okay, hold on, one at a time. Fulfilled his duty. So we got duty still, but fulfilled. What else? Conjugal rights. Okay, that's a good example of, all of these show how difficult this word is to translate. Yeah, okay. The word itself is much broader in ways. So when they say conjugal rights, they're using context and treating it as being a very specific thing. But let context do that. Let context do its work. Okay? But duty and affection are very different words. This is not, I don't want to give you the idea this is how you do a word study, but there are two parts to this word. It's a compound word. And the first part is the word where we get an idea of good. It's good. It's one of the words for good in Greek. The other is mind. So you owe a good mind. Well, that's why you don't do a word study that way. It just leaves everyone confused. Okay. But I maintain that what he is talking about here is, I'm going to give you two possibilities of what would be a more literal aspect of this word that does fit within the context properly. It is good attitude or good or positive mindset. Now, I think that's actually very important, because what I think is people are so influenced by verse 4 that they translate verse 3 with verse 4 in mind, and you lose somewhat of the distinction that verse 3 brings. They are related. I'm not going to argue that at all. But how? The first is the idea when it is due her or due him, okay, there's an obligation, okay? That word is owe. You owe something, okay? And it's reciprocal. Both owe. A husband owes the wife owes the husband, okay? Then it's the idea of the word to give, okay? And it's a more specific where you give away or, well, that's probably as best I can do, is give away, is in return. So the most important word is that idea of what's affection or duty, or conjugal rights. Well, conjugal rights is looking all the way to verse 4. I don't think that's correct. But rather, it's the part before that. Okay? So I'm going to try my best as I look out at this audience, I'm going to try my best to explain this. The problem that can come from an improper use of this passage is if we fail to get verse 3, that we end up with treating sexuality and marriage as it ends up being it can become a war or some kind of, a hurtful thing, when that's exactly opposite of what it should be. Of whether or not you end up with that's something that is, when I say then absolutely, or hey, the door's locked, to go sleep in the doghouse tonight. Okay. Verse 3 actually answers that. Verse 3 is the mindset, you owe one another. Remember, he just said it is to be exclusive. That was verse 2, the nature of it. That it is to be exclusive. Just your spouse. You owe it to maintain a mindset toward that end with your spouse and only your spouse. And that this takes action, preparation. It takes the decision that I'm going to, number one, think of my spouse in this way, because that's a struggle for some, and only think of my spouse this way. That's when I say it's this proper mindset or the right attitude, that it's the in-between part here. That if we just conflate it with verse 4, we miss out on that. The attitude you have generally toward your spouse is key. Why? Because it's setting the context for what he's about to say in verse 5. The behavior you have toward your spouse generally, your mindset, is just as important as what he's about to say and affects what happens in verse 5. Okay, I've seen a lot of hands. I need to get to them. Okay, David? Yes. Yeah, you go back to Ephesians 5, and this now makes, it fits in with love, the love of the husband for the wife and the respect that the wife should have of her husband. Yeah, hopefully that fits in well. John, I think you had something? Okay. Hannah, did you have something? Okay, yeah. Yes, yes. It is, that's why, okay, Hannah says that the word, and she's back to the word that means to give, and I said that was a very specific word of giving away, is that there's an expectation involved, okay? And what the point of the verse is, the expectation is not improper, but that it is to be coupled, that what is expected, should be expected, is a right frame of mind toward one another that is far more encompassing. We call this the environment. In my book on marriage, I talked about this being more of this is the environment of marriage. This should be the good, proper environment of marriage in which the nature of that relationship, of what's the sexual part, fits in naturally rather than abruptly. In many people's marriages, I'll tell them that there's a long pause between verse 3 and 4. And that we have this idea of the expectation of verse 4 without the obligation of verse 3. Okay? I'm going to get all sorts of feedback on how I've handled this so far, trying to explain it, but I'm hoping to do so well. Okay. Let's go ahead. We've been talking about it. Let's go ahead and move into verse 4. But all of these things now are moving on one another and building on it. So verse 4, the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. And likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. And now, that translation is probably pretty good. It is, but it's lent itself toward to a misinterpretation of application, shall we say. Okay? That is, when you marry, you are giving up that part to some degree. Now there's a limiting aspect on this. Is that there is an obligation sexually in marriage for both. That is a proper expectation. That's one of the reasons God created it. And therefore there is an obligation to fulfill it. Now here's the thing, is what it says, so we make sure we contextualize it. If we take a statement, the wife does not have authority over her own body, and we just lift that entirely out of context. Okay? Now what does she become? Out of context. Property. Somewhat. It was changing in this time period. Actually, we're going to get to this in chapter 11. Corinth they had their own ERA movement. Didn't go so well. But this idea here of authority it's a limited idea. She's not the only one. And notice the same thing is true for him. Okay? So, contextually, and this is where you get ultimately verse 5, he's going to then flip and say something about the counter to this, take the negative of where he's been going. He's been leading us through to understand the propriety versus the assumption of impropriety, total propriety, but the context of mindset with an understanding of obligation, and that in marriage, part of the vow is, I am not the only one to consider in this. This is a passage about considering the other. All right? If we go into it looking at it as, I get to tell the other what to do all the time, especially in the bedroom, then we have just eliminated all the other Christian aspects of marriage, thrown those away. That's not what he's saying. Okay? It's about understanding that there is that there should be a mutual consideration of the other needs, how they are, their desires, all those things should be your consideration now. That there's an obligation there. And that idea extends, and that there is, in marriage, there is obligation sexually. But not to be a sexual slave. Okay? And if we can't understand where that difference is, then we will have to have another conversation. But so you have the idea of getting the right mindset, but also the right consideration of the nature of having authority. That's a tough word, the idea of authority. So I don't think it's wrong as it's translated, but it's the whole idea of the exclusive nature of that she's giving up exclusive rights to that, and she's now handing that over to her husband. But that's true for her husband too. Okay? What now? You are in a union, go back to Genesis 2, verse 24, in which you are to consider one another essentially part of you. And in doing so, consider all what the other person is going through as well as what you are. And that finding then unity in these things, because of starting with the right mindset, right obligations, and the right sense of what marriage is about and does. So it's about recognizing, and this is, sometimes it's hard for some people to realize, no, this is a decision you made when you choose to marry. And sadly, I've seen some that was not ever addressed, apparently, in saying, no, this is how it is. And while I can appreciate, I think sometimes that there's trauma involved that creates these problems, but that needs to be resolved. Okay? And we need to make sure we address that. Okay, verse 5. Do not deprive one another except with consent for a time, that you may give yourselves to fasting and prayer. Not all of you will have fasting. And come together again so that Satan does not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Now I'm going to be again believe it or not, I've been oversimplifying some of this for some of the difficulties involved in this. Deprive, defraud is actually pretty good. Is that you're cheating one another of something that is owed, right? If there is an obligation, it's interesting because of some of the choices of words. He began with the idea of repayment, of that to give away, all these things. And now we have, and what you owe, and now we're getting to the idea of cheating or defrauding someone. All of those things have almost a financial idea, which is rather fascinating considering the topic. What are you doing? You're cheating. You would be cheating someone. It says, but he provides an exception here. Except with consent. Out of symphony is the word now. Just to give you an idea of that. The total coming together in saying that this is what we're going to do. But notice the reason why. That you may give yourselves to fasting and prayer. And again, fasting is not in all of the texts. That's its own study. But it's a spiritual purpose. And that is, there are times in which the obligations, spiritual obligations or considerations, you're giving priority. That is actually the one thing that you should recognize as being a thread. That the only exception he is going to give of where what he has said before, you kind of put a pause to, is when there are spiritual things to consider. That's it. Okay, that's the only thing involved, are there spiritual things to consider. And that you would then, though he says, and come together again. Notice the reason, so that Satan does not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. he's pointing out, I think this is straightforward, though there are actually some other ways to consider this. Is that sometimes people will do, and I think what he's addressing is what we saw in the verse 1. The idea of, because I can handle this more, and so therefore I'm more spiritual, and that's good. He said no, it's not one of those things where we just, this is for spiritual reasons and go. No, he says it needs to be for a short while and with an understanding of when it ends that both recognize and agree on. Okay? Not one person, no, I'm still busy in prayer. Okay, so all of the wording, I want you to now look at all of these words, and not just the words themselves, but on the thoughts, what he has done throughout these first few verses, on how he has worked in the concepts in various ways of unity, of reciprocity, of always considering the other. And that is actually the theme by which he is conducting himself through this passage on sexuality. Now, the reason why I think that is really, really important is to break us away from the popular modern thinking, and that is sexuality is simply, number one, impulse-oriented, that it is all about just whatever pleases you, right? All these kind of things. And all of those, I want you to understand, are corruptions of what God created this for. See, the first thing people forget when you get over here to the far side, we talked about verse 1, is that God created sexuality intentionally. And it went beyond just for procreation, okay? He invented it for more than that. But you're seeing that developed here, that it is designed, okay, everybody? It is built by design to motivate you to strengthen every other aspect of your marriage. It is cement. And there's a reason, if you want to think about this just scientifically, okay, physiologically. Essentially, you have 2 years, okay? 2 years on average in a sexual relationship of where you get the benefits of all the oxytocin and the endorphins and everything of making you googly-eyed, and where this is, I'm so in love. Okay, you got about 2 years of that. Put it on your calendar now. Okay, so you got the clock's ticking. Okay, so rest of you are all like, yeah, that's about right. Okay. Okay, why is that? Because what that does, if properly handled, it's providing the means of teaching you other skills and building the love that should have been developed before you ever got married. In agape love, philia love, storge love. See, we've got it all flipped around today. We go with attraction first, and then hopefully one day we'll work our way to commitment, maybe. Whereas thinking of people, of what's best for them, and doing what it takes to have a good relationship with one another by working on me, of what agape love is, that actually should start every relationship. and then we work our way to friendship, to where we have so much in common, and then belonging is developed, where now there can be the next stage, which would be eros, which would be romance. Okay. Then, because you have these things developed, that's why I say this is the cement, that it allows time and gives time and context for all those things to really be strong. Why? Because that won't last forever, and instead, these other forms of love are what you need to build, because that then will turn around and will feed your romance. This and other things you can get if you will come to my marriage seminar. I'm just kidding. Okay, this is the things that we don't think about. We probably, I don't think, give God credit. He's actually placed in Scripture far more about marriage at a high level in terms of how to make this really work well than what people think. It takes, though, a lot of reflection, and I realize that some of this is, you have to kind of dig into it and language stuff. But there's a lot here. There's a lot here. There's a lot in Proverbs. And there's a lot in different, Ephesians 5, 1 Peter 3. But it's not like reading a big, long book on marriage. It's about these short snippets that require you to think long and hard about, how do I do that? How do I make this work, and how do I do this the right way about marriage? So anyway, we don't have enough time to move forward, but I wanted to get through that part of this. Hi, Paco. That's right. That's all they see, and they miss all this context, and that's so sad. Yeah. All right, we will pick up there next week. Surprise.